Tennis is one of the most popular sports around the world, and there are plenty of people out there betting on it. This podcast gives you an edge over the market thanks to in-depth analysis from our expert guests. Welcome to Advantage Bettors. Hello and welcome to Advantage Bettors, the show here to help you prepare for every Grand Slam in the tennis calendar and, of course, find any betting value that might be on offer in the market. We're a week away from the Australian Open and getting close, so still plenty of time to analyse the odds and get some general betting advice. And thankfully, we've got two true experts in their field on today. First up is a tennis analyst and long-time Pinnacle contributor, Dan Weston. How are you, Dan?
Yeah, I'm good, Ben. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really well. And we've also got a sports handicapper, co-host of the brilliant Deep Dive podcast, someone who was getting into the intro music there, I think, a little bit. Drew, how's things going?
Oh, it's going great, man. This is so exciting to finally have real tennis back. This is going to be a great week. If you just look up and down, there is fascinating matchups. We're going to get to see some great tennis this week in the run up to the Australian Open next week. And, you know, normally the Australian Open is happening in January. And this year it's moved back in the calendar a little bit, which to me is a huge relief. I could not be happier that it doesn't cross over with NFL playoffs and NBA going full steam. It's kind of in the exact sweet spot of a time when the sports betting calendar is kind of quiet. So this is awesome this year for sure. I cannot wait for it.
Yeah, nice transition, I guess, from you for Super Bowl into the Australian Open. Dan, is it something you've kind of been waiting for over the Christmas period and start of the new year?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, with the kind of different time zone issues to Drew, for example, I quite like the new season. I always kind of describe it as like the sort of first day at school again kind of thing, you know. I missed it when it. You know, we had the first week and then we had a kind of 2 or 3 week gap when they played the qualies and the players quarantined in Melbourne as well. So it kind of is a bit sort of stop-start so far this year. So I'm glad we've kind of kicked into some massive tournaments this week with pretty much everyone playing who's going to be in the draw at least one match as well. So that's really good in terms of starting to try and get some kind of form line on the players where, you know, sometimes players go into the slams cold sometimes. So these circumstances this year, maybe it's a little bit more advantageous for us than it sometimes could have been the case in the past.
Yeah, I mean, what we'll do is we'll dive into the Australian Open in a little bit. And as you said, we've had some events to kind of sink our teeth into already this season. But before we do all of that, let's take a little bit of kind of a rewind and maybe talk about the weird season that we had last year. Obviously, with everything going on, there was limited action. So I'd like to know, kind of generally speaking, Dan, from your perspective, how was the year of 2020 from a tennis betting perspective? Did you learn anything new? What was it like?
Yeah, I think the most overriding thing for me was that it was very, very tricky and I think that a lot of caution needed to be given generally because, you know, we had a full season pretty much until the start of March and then only really got back into action towards the beginning of August. And we had no real clue about players' levels coming out of lockdown. It was incredibly difficult to understand which players were going to come out well and which players didn't. And then we saw some kind of randomish players just suddenly explode into high levels. So I'll give you a couple of examples, like Jennifer Brady on hard courts, Pironkova, who had about 3 years off tour and then suddenly really produced some superb results, which was something that I didn't see coming at all. So that was quite difficult to predict some sort of those random players just getting to the forefront and beating top players as well on occasions. But for me also, the numbers issue was a big problem because we didn't really have good, relevant sample sizes, probably for the first time, really, that I've been dealing with tennis data in over quite a few years now. That was a big problem for me. So the question is, what numbers do you treat as relevant? Do you go longer sample size in terms of surfaces? Do you go shorter sample sizes in terms of, but look at all surfaces and try and look at players on an upward and downward curve? There was a lot of challenges that I felt were really difficult and unique to 2020 that made me want to be quite cautious generally. The other kind of takeaway that I think as well is that we talked about random players just suddenly becoming good which was very difficult to predict. But also, I think young players really come to the fore a little bit more, and oftentimes came out of lockdown stronger than the veterans. And I think that's probably been the case in football as well, soccer in the UK as well. A lot of younger players have really started to blossom towards sort of the end of 2020 and start of 2021. Whereas older players, maybe that's not such the case. Is that motivation thing? Is it a rustiness thing? I don't know, but it just kind of seems to be a thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. The motivation, I think, the older they get, the less inclined you may be to kind of push yourself out there and kind of stay comfortable. But Drew, same question for you, I guess. Someone who, I mean, the NFL season was okay because it was right in that window that was missed anyway. But tennis-wise, how hard were you hit by it, and what did you learn?
Overall, I wouldn't. It wasn't great. Obviously, not having the entire European clay swing. I really enjoy and typically do pretty well week in, week out through that swing. So the fact that we really didn't get, as much tennis through the, when sports were effectively canceled, that was tough. And Dan's point about sample size and what to do with data was very relevant. Yeah, you had to kind of have an entire layer in your handicap where you were doing a very fairly qualitative assessment of just player form. And if you were carefully keeping track of the up and coming stars, the Iga Swiatek's, some of the players who truly showed up and looked like new players, you really could not have used any kind of ELO based assessment of Iga Swiatek's number to correctly price her in any of her French Open matches. And yeah, so there was an entire layer of kind of figuring it out on the fly, using a lot of eye tests, using a lot of kind of networking tools and people who had seen a lot of the tennis being played, talking to them and kind of gauging opinions. The market, I felt like, was a little bit soft at both the US Open and the French Open early on because there was so much qualitative aspect to the handicap. But overall, the season went well. I think my couple of my biggest positions came through in the US Open. The getting Medvedev out of the third quarter at a very favorable price was one of my biggest tennis plays of the last several years, and that was pretty. I think he went through without even dropping a set in that one, so I was pretty excited. And then just as a tennis fan, seeing Dominic Thiem finally take a major, a slam title is huge because we've lived in this world for so long where there's really only 3 potential winners in any given men's slam, and now there's 2 because Federer is really not looking like he's going to be part of the equation here in 2021, maybe beyond. And so it was important, I think, to have another young middle tier guy kind of throw his hat in the ring that, oh no, I'm slam caliber now, and I have won. You can't say that, I have never won a slam before. So, granted, he didn't necessarily slay any true champions along the way, but we've seen him beat Djokovic at many times in slams in the past. We've seen him beat Nadal at this Australian Open last year. So I think it's pretty exciting to have another guy in the mix who's truly slam worthy. And that was probably, on the men's side at least, the best possible outcome we could have had in 2021 or 2020, to be honest.
And I guess it kind of raises the question. You both said there you face challenges, and whether that's kind of data wise or whatever it might be. Obviously, it's kind of a level playing field because everyone in the market is going to have those same struggles. So was it something that did either of you kind of try and spin it and really attack the market and take advantage of it? Or were you just on that cautious side and more wary and kind of getting hurt?
Yeah, I was well more cautious. I did not feel like I had a very confident handicap going in match by match for sure. But it did, I think, open up better opportunities to attack futures markets. And my portfolio looks very different than a normal tennis season in terms of how I was weighting match betting versus futures betting last year.
And what about yourself, Dan?
Yeah, it's very similar, really. I said about the caution before regarding numbers, and I think that definitely translated into to the way that you might approach the markets as well. I mean, it's so difficult to really have a confident lean towards players on a sort of match by match basis when you don't have a lot of recent numbers or relevant numbers. And also sometimes you think, oh, wow, is this price too good to be true? Does the market know more than me, kind of thing? Which, perhaps you wouldn't have those doubts in normal circumstances, but given these unique set of circumstances, you think, trying to second guess yourself a little bit sometimes as well.
Well, you've both mentioned a couple of players. So if you do look back now and you're thinking ahead to this season, who is on that kind of watch list, or who are the players that perhaps you're digging around into their data a little bit more than perhaps you might have done had we not seen that sort of uplift in their performance? And Drew, I'll start with you on that one, a sort of watch list for 2021, if you will.
Yeah. So at the very top of the men's tour, for sure, I'm curious if Andrei Rublev can take another step forward. He had moments last year that were superlative. He showed the potential that I think we all expect, which is this guy can be a top 4 player for a long time. And it will be important to see him take some meaningful steps forwards this year in slam opportunities. I think, he has the class, he can do it. And he's absolutely somebody that I think you're going to see take home probably 3 kind of mid-tier titles this year. He'll take home a couple of 500s and maybe win a Masters, would be kind of the read I have on his season. But it's potential that he could surpass that for sure. He could absolutely make a run at one of these slams because he's got the goods. It'll be interesting to see if he puts any additional tools in his chest and or gets, things are going to have to break right for him. He's going to have to get the right part of the draw. He's going to have to miss out on he's going to need Djokovic to get DQ'd for hitting a linesman or something crazy, but it could happen. So I Rublev for sure is somebody I'm excited to see. Demon Hour is another young player who should take a meaningful step forward that I'm excited to see. Jannik Sinner was outstanding through a handful of his matches at the French Open. He's got the quality that he could make a name for himself this year, finish in the top, say, probably finish in the he may be fringe top 10 by the end of the season if they get all of the clay tournaments played, because his clay game is pretty superlative. And then I'm expecting to see a lot of the older players really, sadly, probably not do much. So this is a transitioning year. I would say I'm not expecting the Wawrinkas to truly compete at the slam level. I doubt we see Federer play this year, although maybe he plays Wimbledon. It's not looking like a great year for the older players. So I do think it is pretty important to circle some of these young guys who have the potential to really make a name for themselves and win some titles.
And Dan, I don't think you're putting the possibility of getting disqualified for hitting a line judge into your model. But what I do know about you is you like Rublev. I think you've talked him up for a little while, year on year, as he's kind of progressed. So I'm assuming you're in the same camp as Drew with that.
Yeah, so very similar in terms of the names that Drew mentioned as well. So Rublev won 5 titles last year, which I don't think many people foresaw before the start of 2020. And in a shortened season as well, that really is some achievement. But he's someone I'm definitely looking to kick on and get towards that sort of top 4, top 5 potentially. As also Drew said, is someone that I think could be ballpark top 10-ish by the end of the year, if he kicks on nicely. De Minaur is someone that I had massive hopes for before the start of last season, but probably didn't kick on as much as I thought he would have done, but I still retain quite high hopes for him on hard courts in particular. A couple of other players, it's an unoriginal take, but I'm really looking forward to seeing Daniil Medvedev build on last year as well, because his numbers now are getting not far off elite level, and with Djokovic finishing last year in fairly mediocre style, and Nadal having those typical injury problems as well, I think that the door is half ajar for Medvedev to break up the remaining traditional elite 2, if you like, and really put his stamp on the tour this year, and moving forward, as well as being almost the player to beat, the up-and-coming player to beat as the years progress in the future. A couple of younger players who I'm looking to see who are lower ranked than the guys we've discussed so far. Sebastian Korda, who did well already in Delray Beach, is someone that I've got real high hopes for. Obviously, comes from a family with great sporting pedigree as well, with his dad a former slam winner and his sister doing very, very well on the LPGA tour as well in golf. And also Lorenzo Musetti, particularly on clay, I think could be someone who picks up some 250 titles, for example, on clay, maybe could get to the latter stages of 500, or even a Masters, like quarterfinal of a Masters or something like that would be really good progress for him in 2021 as well.
And both of you have referenced on the men's side that sort of elite bracket that people are trying to sort of break into. It hasn't really been the case on the women's side for a while. And it's event to event. It's such a wide open field, and no one's really kind of grabbed that opportunity. So it's so difficult to say who's going to emerge as that sort of elite player. Is there maybe someone that you could see sort of making their way into that sort of tier of sort of 10 women that are at the top of the game?
I honestly can't tell you from tournament to tournament who's going to be the one. It's crazy. It's almost like two different sports when you're doing the futures outright market handicap in these. It's like you have 2 or 3 true contenders in any man's slam, and in every women's it's like 25, and it's exciting. It absolutely makes it entertaining. And the match by match quality, especially earlier in slams, you catch some matches where you just happen to have 2 women who truly could win it all face off in round 2, round 3. Like it's very high quality tennis being played on the women's side right now. And I think actually, if you kind of go back over the last probably 12, 16 slams, and you just said which was more entertaining between the men's and women's, the women's probably 12 out of the last 16 was clearly the more entertaining, viewer experience from beginning to end. But yeah, it's there for sure are kind of more clear, in my opinion, peaks and valleys in terms of player performance over the course of the year on the women's side, less consistency maybe, and kind of capturing the right player at the right time, who has the goods is pretty important. Women last year like Sophia Kenin, who emerged in the at the Australian Open, had other parts of her calendar which were very unimpressive, and we're going to see BB Andreescu back this year, which is exciting. I think the tennis world missed her last year. And I'm excited to see the quality of play that she presents. Obviously, Sabalenka has taken an enormous step forward in her game, and it's going to be exciting to see if she can actually find major success for the first time. So there's a lot of potential. If you told me who is going to even end the year ranked world number 1 in the women's side, I would probably give you 10 names. Seriously, it could be one of any 10, which is crazy.
Great from a fan perspective, not so much from a prediction or betting perspective. But Dan, is there anyone that, if Drew pressed you on that, who's going to be number 1, or who would you sort of say could be one to watch?
I completely agree with everything that Drew said. I mean, like you can't pick a name and say, okay, well, I really think that they've got a great chance of getting to number 1. And I think that's the beauty of the women's game, sort of post-peak Serena Williams, if you like, because we've got every tournament. There's 24 or more players who could go and have a justifiable case for reaching the latter stages with confidence, and as he says, 25, 30 players can go into the Australian Open and think, well, do you know what? I could get to quarterfinals or better in this particular tournament. There's just so much quality, and also a really nice level playing field in the women's game right now, which is obviously the complete opposite to men. So yeah, Sabalenka, Drew mentioned earlier, she's now like 15 unbeaten, finished last year with a couple of titles as well. So I think that she's a player that the outright market could get on side real quickly. If she starts the tournament well, she could easily drop in price quite quickly, I think, given that sort of recency bias, and I think the market will latch on to that. It'd be interesting to see if Azarenka can maintain that progress after rapidly improving after the tour resumed as well. Weston Southern title and US Open final as well. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing Igor Swiatek go get back on tour on a hard court as well, because I think at the moment I've pegged her as something of a clay court specialist right now. So I want to see her perform well on other surfaces as well, and sort of back up the great numbers that she's got on clay. You know, I've pegged her as a player of high potential for a couple of years, but even I was shocked to see that run at the French Open. So that there's that's something that I'm really looking forward to seeing her do. If she can exhibit, like I'd say, a top 10 level on hard court and be one of the best players on tour on clay, then the future's going to be really bright for her as well.
Well, I think it's obviously great to kind of get some names and thoughts about sort of who you guys are thinking could sort of develop this year, and we'll talk about it specifically to the Australian Open as well, about the odds and who you think might be a good play. But the reason we do these kind of shows is it's not to spoon feed people that go and bet on this. It's more about the kind of thought process behind it. So you two, you obviously put a lot of time into the handicapping to kind of get to your numbers and get to your players. So for those listening now, that we're not going to go tell them who to bet on. How to bet is probably the more important thing and things to think about. So I'll open the floor and just maybe some kind of do's and don'ts of tennis betting that you two abide by.
Okay. Well, I think just to piggyback on what Dan was just saying, when you're entering the futures market on a slam, it's a fun way to play it. Absolutely. You know, it's if you enjoy, say, the March Madness sort of bracket style, like, you know, I'm going to, you know, that sort of, you know, idea of a tournament is you get one of those in tennis every week. And the slam is the most fun of them because you have to win 7 matches to do it. And you have a 128 player field. And in general, the futures market is ripe for opportunities. So it's a really fun way to play these slams. And to piggyback on Dan's point, you are almost always trying to make a play on a player whose market number is going to get shorter relatively quickly, right? You're not looking at a futures market and saying, I'm going to predict the winner. We're going to take this player, or even these 3, right? You realistically are looking for prices that are going to become much shorter over the course of the 2 weeks. And there are 2 ways that a player wins a slam. You know, they do the hard work themselves. They get a tough draw and they take out the other contenders on their way, or they happen to be on a part of the draw without the tough players, and you can let chaos play off in one quarter, you know, or the other, and your player has a relatively kind of favorable road just based on matchup. Or, you know, like you'll find certain quarters of the draw where, okay, we're on a fast hard court here in Melbourne, and this particular quarter happens to be, you know, the ranked players are all clay specialists, and their ranking is born out of clay success. And, you know, their own, you know, the ranked players may be all relatively soft in one portion or the other, and provide a favorable path to a late round appearance for some of these players. And I think so price shopping is obviously important at market entry. You know, when, you know, you're making a play, knowing that this number is only going to go one way on you, is probably the name of the game in the futures market. And then, you know, what you're doing game by game should have virtually no correlation to the way that you're attacking the futures market. You shouldn't necessarily be afraid to make a play on a player if you see value, even though you have a future, and vice versa. And, you know, if you're making a futures play on anyone that's in the 10-1 range, you need them realistically to get to the semifinals to materialize real hedging value out of it. You know, don't play into the futures market thinking, okay, how soon can I hedge this? You know, realistically, you want to, you know, expect to get to the quarterfinals or semifinals before you can realize true value out of those plays. And then if you're into someone in the 50 to 100-1 range, you realistically need them to get to the quarters to materialize value out of that. And so sometimes it's more favorable to attack the market of who's going to win a given quarter as opposed to who's going to win outright. Winning outright, especially on the men's side, is not an easy task when you're a long shot. I don't think we've had a true long shot win on the men's side in, I'm going to guess it's been at least 80 slams since we had a real long shot on the men's side win. So any of those plays, you need to be making those bets, expecting that it's going to get a lot shorter, and you're going to take your liability out, take your equity out in some way besides seeing that title, you know, future actually cash. So those are sort of the kind of big picture macro level thoughts that go into my head looking at the futures market, at least. And that's kind of where we are, at least now, for the Australian Open in terms of my process. So I'll leave some of the match by match thoughts up to Dan.
Yeah. So, I mean, Drew's been really, really thorough in terms of how he would approach the outright market futures. And that, I think that's a really good illustration of the research that a top level bettor will do in advance of tournaments to try and yield profit on a regular basis. And I think that's a really broad point in terms of advice to give to someone who wants to be better at what they do. And that is, the fact is that there's people who are putting a ton of time and effort and resources into trying to beat the market. There's people running all sorts of detailed models and people who watch matches day in, day out. There's various approaches to this, but what I'm trying to say is that if you don't perform that in-depth research or you don't put the effort in full stop, then you're probably not going to beat the market, because if there's people who do it, then if you don't do it, then you're giving them an edge straight away.
Never a truer word spoken, Dan. I think that applies to each and everything you bet on pretty much. So yeah, some really good advice. Do you think there's any sort of common misconceptions? I mean, I'm sure you guys must be flooded with DMs on Twitter and stuff like that for people asking for advice and whatnot. Is there some common things that you see that people are overestimating or overvaluing that don't really matter that much?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I'm sure there are people out there who think it's as simple as, what surface is this? This player is good on this surface, and they don't realize that, of course, the market price reflects that. So there's almost certainly some people who will use what they think is a shortcut for quality, for the surface is probably the first thing that comes to any person's mind who's doing a quick handicap. And I got somebody good on hard going against somebody who's good on clay. Obviously, this is on hard. I'm going to bet the guy that's the better hardcore player, and realizing, okay, well, obviously that's going to be reflected in the price in some way. That's probably a pretty common shortcut that people are making a quick bet just based on surface. And in reality, there's almost certainly you need to have something more than that. I would also say, people are very often fooled by recency bias, as Dan kind of brought it up earlier. There's market momentum for certain players who are doing well, who are rewarding bettors. They'll go back to the well over and over and over again, continuing to bet that player until they eventually lose. And so you will see market momentum for sure. It's not as clear as like, okay, well, there's always going to be a premium betting the Lakers in the NBA, because there's always a premium betting the Lakers. But there will be players who for sure generate market support pretty quickly, just based on quality of performance, and that can go both ways. I think fatigue is often under handicapped to a degree, especially if you can find micro examples of where fatigue may matter more. For sure, it matters for different players in terms of how they play the game. For sure, it matters different players in terms of, okay, well, did they came off a 5-set match? Well, was it in the middle of the day in the Melbourne sun, or was it at night under the roof? Right? There's for sure there is different quality of kind of damage that's accrued over the course of a slam. Best of 5 tennis is brutal. So it's very, very, it's long, hard matches. And oftentimes it's under weighted, in my opinion, in forward sense of how long and how hard the previous match was. There's not a clear, obvious, okay, people are making this simple mistake often that you can capitalize on it on the other way around, for sure. I mean, the market is very, very efficient in general. And if your numbers are way off what you're seeing in a given match, there's a reason. You need to get to the bottom of it.
Well, I guess one of the things you mentioned there, Drew, was the court surface, which is clearly a very, very straightforward go-to for a lot of people. And Dan, I know when you sort of talk about things, a lot of the time you'll mention conditions. And I think it's important to maybe let people or kind of educate people around the fact that it's not just the court that's played on, it's the weather that's there, and even that no two hard courts are the same. Even clay courts, you can get very different clay courts. So maybe, Dan, you can sort of elaborate a little bit about the importance of conditions, surface, and how they mix together.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that what Drew said about, a lot of sort of casual bettors, if you like, adopting that, it's a hard court, this person's good on hard court versus that person who's bad on clay court. Well, that's a really good example of what I was saying earlier about how you won't beat the market if you don't put the research in that other people are putting in. And I think that it's really important for people to realize is that these courts don't play the same. So there's different court manufacturers, there's different balls, there's different climatic conditions, and all these variables go into creating different conditions from tournament to tournament. And I think at least a good starting point is to try and work out which tournaments generally historically have quicker or slower conditions, and also which players perform well in faster and slower conditions as well. So, for example, Drew said earlier, and I agree with him about the Australian Open has fairly quick conditions for a hard court, and someone like, for example, in the women's tournament, Ekaterina Alexandrova is a real fast conditions specialist. So does that give her an edge over someone who is a good hard courter but perhaps prefers conditions a little bit slower? So that's just one example of that. But understanding those nuances, I think, is really, really important. Also, kind of, you mentioned earlier about sort of people asking for advice and stuff, and messaging you asking for advice. And I think that the couple of things that I pick up on a lot from people is poor bankroll management is something that's really, really key. So, let's say for sake of argument, you had this amazing ideal world where you had 8 to 10% implied edge on every single bet that you did. Well, if you're putting a half of your bankroll on every single bet that you do, even with that edge, there's a really good chance that you're going to go bust, because it doesn't take much variance for that to happen. You've got to have a really good start, otherwise you're gonna be in big trouble. So having that bankroll management is very, very important for a novice bettor or someone looking to take things more seriously, because otherwise, if you don't have good financial management, then you're in big trouble from the start. And along those lines as well, trying to avoid putting emotion into the decision-making process as well is really key. So I'll give you a good example of some context there. I mean, I've had someone message me before and said, I think I might have said that to bet on someone against Federer, and they're like, how can you bet against Federer? The guy's a legend or something like that. I'm like, because that's what the numbers say. That's where I'm at right now. And, I couldn't care less about this guy who's won, I don't know how many he's won these days, but 20 Grand Slam titles or something like that. I'm looking at the match that's in the here and the now. His reputation means nothing at that point in time. So, you've got to avoid not betting against someone, but you've also got to avoid betting on someone because he's your favorite player or something like that as well. There's just this basic discipline and removing emotion, and almost, I guess, to some extent, treating player instead of looking at it, say, Djokovic v Federer, look at it as player X v player Y, and not bringing the names into the equation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Real quick to add to the bankroll management part of it, there's a natural funneling of less and less matches as the tournament goes on. This is obvious, right? But if you're not doing well early on, the idea of, oh man, I need to up my stakes in these ones to catch up, or or the fact that there are fewer matches, but you're like, well, I want to get a bet down anyway, but maybe there's probably not an edge if it's you're late in a tournament and it's Nadal versus Djokovic. The market knows exactly how to price that. It's happened 100 times. This is not a, you want me to guess what the number was? I can get within a few cents, because it's happened so often, right? But because of sort of the nature of the tournament where there are fewer and fewer matches, the attention gets up as you get later in the tournament. So sometimes people will drop in and they'll be like, well, do you have a tip? I mean, this is the quarterfinals. This is exciting. I'm going to watch this, there for sure. Almost always match by match, you're going to find bigger edges earlier in the tournament because there are more matches to pick from. And, you can definitely get yourself into trouble either if you're winning or losing early, just based on the nature of the sort of the decreasing sample.
And just to your point, Dan, I think if anyone out there doubt the level of research or how granular people get in their analysis. As you were talking, I was reminded of an article Jonathan Breike wrote for Pinnacle, where he looked at, was it Roland Garros changed the balls? And it was this in-depth analysis of sort of the impact that potentially that could have on points and stuff like that. So great example of
every year, every slam, there's some macro stuff like that you can be contrarian on if you want to, because it's a lot of it is speculative, and the ball was a big one. People thought, and I was tentative getting involved with Nadal at Roland Garros because of the two factors. That the ball changed and the weather was different. And I was a little spooked. I was like, man, what if he can't get the same top spin on his shots? Like, oh, there's a real chance that he's vulnerable. No, he was as good as he always is, because it's, he absolutely, owns every aspect of everyone's game on clay because of his style. And it didn't matter that they changed the balls, really. I mean, I looked at one point about what his spin rate was like with the damper weather and with the less fuzzy balls, and it was within margin of error of what he's always done at on Chatrier. So that stuff I forgot about that, but for sure there are macro levels kind of thoughts that the market, I think, builds into pricing at the onset of some of these tournaments that just never manifests. Was it last year that there was just massive wildfires going on in Melbourne and the air quality was bad, and people were like, well, Djokovic has, potential. He's had breathing issues in the past. He's dealt with asthma and things when he was younger. Maybe he's vulnerable at the Australian Open, and then, he wins without dropping a set or something. So there for sure are macro things like that you will read and see and hear people kind of, write about, because they need something. They need to create some content. People are interested and they want to read and have some macro ideas. And a lot of times you can probably fairly go contrarian on that stuff and do fine. I wouldn't be surprised.
I think one of the things you mentioned there, Drew, was the weather and kind of reading into that. And now we were kind of chatting a little bit before we started hitting record. I think you might have mentioned it at the top of the show as well, but obviously where we're at in the calendar and the fact that the Australian Open's a little bit longer, what does that mean for you in terms of how to approach things for this event?
Okay, so my general 2 cents handicapping the Australian Open when we get started, and a normal year, it's usually the third week in January is the start of the tournament. There has usually been a very clear, normal tennis year preceding it. And the normal tennis year that precedes it is always interesting to me because it has sort of a few phases. Right at early in the year, things are a little chaotic. They're a little random. Some very good players completely stink, and some very suspect players from the previous year burst out, come out of nowhere. Some of the biggest upsets that I've ever seen in life in tennis have happened at the Australian Open. Dennis Istomin beating Djokovic in 5 sets. I think he was something like 100 or 500 to 1 to win that match alone, and he does it in 5 sets in absolutely one of the crazier ways you ever wanted to see it. I think in that same tournament, Misha Zverev beat Andy Murray as like 100 to 1, 80 to 1 pre-match, and those type of things tend to happen early in the Australian Open because you have this gap in the calendar year where the previous year ends in November-ish. There's nobody really plays in December. And then there's a really quick ramp up to very high level play before the Australian Open. You basically have 1 or 2 tournaments max to really get yourself into form for this. And for a player like Andy Murray, the year prior to getting upset by Misha Zverev, he really wanted to end the year world number 1. That was very clearly his stated goal. And everyone was written about ad nauseum in the UK. And he played so many tournaments down the stretch there, played so hard to secure that when world number 1. He does it. And then to see him have kind of a layoff where he had to regroup from how much tennis he had been playing, and then coming into the Australian Open, so quickly, wasn't able to get up to top form that quickly. That does happen for sure in a normal year. This year, throw it all out because number 1, the tournament is later. So we're starting here now in February. So players have had a little bit of time to get their legs under them. And number 2, most players didn't have a full calendar year of tennis last year. In fact, everyone on tour had a light year last year. You know, they're all relatively rested. Everyone should be in good physical shape. You've been dealing with nagging injuries for your whole career. Well, guess what? You just had an entire perfect, uninterrupted time period to get right. And now here you go. Like this, so there for sure, you're going to see, I think, higher quality play, better performances overall, just because these players are less worn down. There's less mileage, less wear and tear recently. And kind of the other aspects of the tennis calendar that make sense are you'll see guys who try to peek through the European clay swing, right? They look at the calendar and their goal is, okay, I'm going to come into the U.S. Masters double at Indian Wells in Miami, and I'm going to get what I can get there in terms of money and points, and then but I'm really focusing on this European clay swing, and I'm going to peak during this swing, and then whatever I can get in the U.S. hard court swing that comes after that, I will. And then once you get into fall, I'm going to rest and recuperate and be prepared for the following season. And you can a lot of times catch those guys who are sort of on that cycle, who come into Australia, who are a little bit more rested, a little less fatigue in the fall, and they're ready to go. And that has been totally disrupted. So I think for sure it is a much more open playing field across, the entire men's tour than you would have in a normal year. I think that should make, in my mind, at least I'm telling myself that's going to make my numbers more valuable. There'll be less qualitative stuff off the top here, even though we don't have a ton of signal sample recency, recent results to pick from with these guys. But I do think that in general, it's going to be more of a level playing field than in a normal year. And number two, it looks like beautiful, cool weather in Melbourne. And it is the surface of the sun hot in the early part of January in Melbourne, usually. And that absolutely has huge impact on the older players who played during the day. And you can almost always do you look at the order of play, you find two older guys who are in a match that's lined about 50-50, and it's in the middle of the day, and you're like, okay, that's going to be a hot, brutal match. And sure enough, it goes 5 sets. The winner is, he's been out on court for 5 hours in in 99 degree heat, 100% humidity. And that guy is done. His tournament is over. And it's sometimes it's priced incorrectly, but other times, you just wait for the opening number on the next one. It's like, oh, well, he was playing a guy that was playing during the night. And he was in a 3-setter, or he was also in the day, but it was shorter, and those type of angles, which are usually the bread and butter of my Australian Open, I think are going to be gone this year because it looks absolutely beautiful. So this is going to be a very different tournament in terms of the overall kind of who's upsets versus, chalk prevailing. Like, a typical Australian Open is wild upsets in round 1 and 2, and then chalk the rest of the way. And I would guess that this is going to be a more of likely to see a chalky tournament from beginning to end. I don't know that there's many, underdogs who have a true advantage, given that so many of the good players have had time to rest and recuperate and work on their games. And in general, if you're a player who has more money and has a better team and has a better physio and has a better training, gym at your home where you've been, spending most of your time, those type of players, I think the cream should rise to the top pretty quickly in this tournament.
Well, good weather or better weather for the players, not so good for Drew's betting age. What does it mean for you, Dan?
Yeah, well, I was going to make the point about the weather as well. So as Drew said, usually it's so hot in Melbourne in January, but looking at the forecast, it's going to be like ballpark 20 degrees C in
Looks beautiful.
Yeah. So will that have an impact on the court speed, for example? How will we ascertain that? Well, we're going to have to look at the data for the first round, for example, and compare that to the first round of the year before or the year before that and stuff. And we've got to see matches take place and get that data to really make any kind of assertions on whether that climatic difference is going to be something that is a thing or not a thing. And the other thing that I think is really sort of unique to this tournament this year, which is worth making the point about, is that, like, every player's had to do this quarantine coming into Australia, but they're not quite sort of all on a level playing field in terms of what they could and couldn't do during this quarantine. So some players got the ability to practice for a short while each day, whereas other players literally didn't leave a hotel room with an open. They didn't even have the benefit of any fresh air from an open window for 2 weeks. So I think that the players who kind of had that little bit of time on court will arguably benefit in these warm-up events this week and the early rounds of the Australian Open. I mean, coming from, say, Europe or the US to Australia, awful time zones, and then having to sit in a hotel room for 2 weeks, basically binging probably on junk food and watching Netflix, is probably not the best preparation for a best of 5 sets Grand Slam, I wouldn't have thought. So yeah, I mean, that's something I think is, maybe something to bear in mind for this particular tournament. But unless you plow through social media feeds for players, I'm not sure there's like a clear list about which players were in which conditions, if that makes sense.
Well, I think Heather Watson did a triathlon, didn't she, in a hotel room or something like that? In the bath and running. I think she ran a 5K just up and down to the door and back. Right, let's get on to the Australian Open and the odds that are up. I said earlier that we're not going to kind of spoon feed people who are the picks, but it's good to get your guys' insight, I think, on kind of where the market's at. For the men, it's, as you'd expect, the usual guys up there. Djokovic leading the way. He's kind of consensus just over odds against at 2.2, 2.4. Medvedev, Nadal, team fairly close behind, sort of 5-6 to 1 range, and you could probably put Tsitsipas up in that top bracket as well. He's just over double digits in terms of price. So in terms of that sort of bank of 5 guys at the top, is there price-wise anyone that jumps out or people that you just steer well away from at where they are in the market?
I think the market is shaped very well, considering we don't exactly know how these the second tier of guys are going to shake out in the draw. It's going to be draw dependent for each of them. I think, pretty clearly, Djokovic standing alone in terms of price and level and being close to 50% chance to win is very close to my number. I'm a little shorter than 2.4, which is, I think, the best price you can find market-wise right now. I'm about 2.2. So I see a little value in Djokovic. He typically is the best player on tour here by far, and it's not necessarily the reason you would expect. This is his absolute ideal it's the ideal conditions for him to use what is the greatest defense in men's tennis to effectively take away the shot making ability of every player on tour on this very fast surface. And he's clearly should be the rightful number one, the rightful market favorite. And he's going to get the best seed. He's going to get the easiest quarter. And he almost certainly, barring some very unusual circumstance, will be at least in the semifinals. And the question is, who does he face in the semifinals? If it's a player like Medvedev, I don't think Medvedev matches up especially well with Djokovic, because he's got almost the same sort of game where I will get everything back, but it's not quite as good. So it's almost like he's at least that I've seen. He's very similar, but not quite as good at that. And he'll probably would not be expected to manifest an upset against Djokovic. He probably would be in the plus. He'd probably be, I would guess, about 3.5 on the money line if they met head to head at the semifinal level. And then you have a player like Thiem who could end up in the second quarter and meet, that would be your semifinal matchup with Djokovic. And Thiem, I think, has a more realistic shot at an upset against him, just his style of play. And he might be in the plus. He'd be probably about 4.0-ish head to head against Djokovic at that spot. And so you're not really manifesting much in the futures market betting either Medvedev or Thiem right now, because either one of those guys is likely going to be in the 3 to 4 ballpark if they meet in the semifinals, right? So that's even assuming that they avoid upset to that point. And then once they, presumably if they pull off that upset and they go to the finals, you would be facing either Nadal or the other one of Team Medvedev. And, that would be pretty close to an even, that would be lined pretty close to even. Now, usually in the Australian Open, you can take there's some margin at the top of the market on Nadal that you can pretty much try to eat somewhere else. That is to say, he is built in usually around 20% chance to win the Australian Open, but in a normal year, he is not likely to win here. This year, I would say because of the general later schedule last year, because of the he's usually takes damage. He's got knee problems when he's playing on hard court through the fall. And if he plays a full fall schedule, by the time Australian Open runs around, he is not ready to be at 100%. And you can usually fade him in the futures market with that margin he's eating at the top of the board. This year is not one of those years, in my opinion. I think he's going to be dangerous here. And I think there's probably a reasonable chance he gets a good draw out of the second quarter here. He's going to be the number 2 seed, if I'm reading correctly. I'll have to double check on that. Actually, I'm not 100% sure if the seeding I've got is current, but Nadal coming out of the second quarter seems likely. If you can find him in the 6-1 range right now, that's not a bad play. I don't ultimately think he wins this tournament, but you could potentially have him 6-1, come out of the bottom half, be in the finals against Djokovic, and then that would be lined in the probably. Let's see. I'm going to guess that'll be Djokovic minus 220-ish, based on past matchups at this venue. So having Nadal at 6-1 and being in that potential finals matchup, worst case scenario, is pretty fair as far as the futures look. And if something happens, if someone beats Djokovic and that's Team or Medvedev in the finals, then Nadal may be evens or even a small favorite. So that's all of the stuff that I see market wide. In a normal year, I would never, ever be betting Nadal at this tournament, but I do think 6-1 is a little short. I make it about 4.5, and you can get it right now at 7. So.
And is it similar sentiments, Dan, or are you going to give us some debate and some argument against the case?
I think we're kind of in alignment through a lot of our thought processes in this podcast so far. Is the fact that Nadal, 7.5 kind of price does look reasonably generous based on numbers wise, and the fact that this is kind of a unique circumstance for the Australian Open as well. The one is difficult one in terms of team. Numbers wise, he doesn't convince me, but he seems to pull out these performances. And I wonder whether the market might be a little bit influenced by the US Open and then coming to the runner-up to Medvedev at the Tour Finals as well. Yeah. But I have Medvedev, not taking into account who they might be playing and matchups and stuff like that. I would have Medvedev rated higher than Team based on my numbers. And you mentioned, Ben, Tsitsipas as that kind of the fifth player. I mean, for me, I think he's quite a long way behind the other guys still. And I mean, I've looked at, say, 20 players who are around 100-1 or shorter in the market. And his return data is one of the worst out of those 20 players. And that's not conducive generally to success in the best of 5 set Grand Slam format. Because if you're not good at return, then you're generally going to be playing longer sets, longer matches. And in a Grand Slam, 7 matches, best of 5 sets, that is not going to be fun generally. And you're opening yourself up to variance and fatigue. And generally speaking, I think that those guys are worth opposing in terms of futures markets.
Yeah, we agree on that.
And then what about a little further down the list, Dan? Is there anyone there that sort of might seem like a bit of a player at much higher odds?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that looking at second-tier players who could probably break through, I would say that Rublev, who we've discussed already, is someone who does have that potential, perhaps more than a lot of other players. I'm absolutely shocked to see that he's a similar price to Nick Kyrgios. He didn't play after he was in the last match in February last year. So that for me is truly bizarre.
He's a similar price as Andy Murray at one book I'm looking at right now.
So I mean, like Rublev's kind of someone who's from that, say second tier. Could Yannick Sinner kick on and really threaten the best players on tour? It's definitely possible. So I'd be looking towards the younger players, the Rublevs, the Sinners, the Duminors, rather than the Wawrinkas and the Kyrgioses and the Bautista Aguts and players like that we know where they're at. We know what their peak is probably right now. Whereas we're not really quite sure with some of the younger players who do have this upside and high potential. And I think that I'd rather get on side with some of the younger players than some of the sort of veterans who have more exposed form lines.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously not a pick to potentially win it, but Drew, your logic of maybe a semi-final or maybe sort of a 50, 100 to 1 shot that could maybe get a few upsets and go to the quarters. Is there someone in that bracket or with that methodology that might appeal?
Yeah, I mean, it's all draw dependent. So right now it's tough to say, I always try to pick off some prices that are just outrageous and nonsense in this time frame, and just cross your fingers that they don't all end up in the same section and that one of those guys has a chance. But it is so draw dependent. But the underlying spirit of what Dan was saying, I completely agree with. After the top 4 guys in this market, there's a huge middle class that I don't think has a realistic shot, and they're all kind of in the 4 or 5, maybe as 4 or 5% chance to win. That is probably 0, and so there is some margin you can attack there. The guys mentioned of them, Demon Hour at 60 to 1 is probably the one that I'm grabbing now. I think that fair price is closer to 35 or 40, and draw dependent. He can absolutely get a path that gets him to at least the quarterfinals. So 60 to 1, you need him to win that quarterfinal upset, and you have a reasonable equity in that position. Denis Shapovalov is a guy that doesn't, I don't shy away from it at 80 to 1. He's never done it at this stage and with the pressure. And so I get why the price is what it is. But from a talent standpoint, 80 to 1 is not a reasonable number, in my opinion. So I'll probably take a shot on that one. And then in the 150 to 1 range, Felix Auger-Aliassime, 150 to 1 is kind of crazy for him. He absolutely has the top level that he can pull off the upset against some of the top tier guys. So again, draw dependent. He should be in the 80 to 1 range, not 150 to 1. And then all of the other guys who are sort of kind of names, I think are overpriced. So, the Zverevs, Alexander Zverev at 20 to 1, I think is ridiculous. Kyrgios at 33 to 1 is ridiculous. Yeah, even Roberto Bautista Agut at 100 to 1 is crazy. He usually does well at this tournament because of the conditions being so hot, and he's a robot and he can play through heat for 5 hours and come out the other side and be fine. Well, that's take that one edge that he has here out of the game, and now he's going to actually have to get it done with the shot making. I don't see that happening. So, reasonably, I think some of the other names, even the Goffins, the Monfils, the Dimitrovs, the Ciliches, Berrettini, Nishikori, I don't think these guys have a reasonable shot outside of blind luck in terms of the draw opening up wide open for them. And so I think there are opportunities to take some long shot cracks at some of the lesser known names.
Well, I'm cautious of the time, but we will get onto the women, and I'll have to put you on the spot. We said how difficult it is to kind of find someone who could be a potential challenger, but to run through the odds there, it kind of tells the story that we've got a favourite at 5 to 1, not strong in the market at all with Osaka. Barty, Sabalenka, Halep, Serena Williams, about 10 others that are between sort of 8 to 1 and 10 to 1. It's going to be difficult, but is there anyone there that is worth a stab, do you think, Dan?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's so difficult with the women's in terms of picking out players specifically. Okay, so my thought process is that I want to find players who've got good 2020 data and good, maybe slightly longer hard court specific data as well, and ideally someone who maybe is a little bit more proven in quicker conditions as well. So, and that makes it really tough in itself. So a couple of players that I think might be some value, but really we're kind of not in a great spot in advance of the draw. We don't know how that's going to play out, and even then, I'm with no background really this year in terms of form lines. It's so tricky. If we want I said earlier, Sabalenka will get a lot of market support, I think, based on the unbeaten run so far, and I think that makes her justifiably a player to beat. I certainly would have her as a shorter price than Ash Barty, for example, at the moment, who didn't play after the tour stopped in March. But at the moment, I think Barty's slightly shorter than Sabalenka right now. Okay, so two names. I don't like it much, but I'll give them to you anyway. In that sort of second tier of players, I quite like Kvitova at ballpark like 25. And of the more outsider players, maybe someone like Elise Mertens at like 80-1 or something like that is someone who has a bit more upside than I think a lot of other people. There's some young players with high potential as well who could do some damage with good draws, and if they play well, someone like Rybakina, who I think we've spoken about on previous pods before, as well as someone with very high potential, and even someone like Marta Kostyuk, who has massive upside in my opinion as an 18-year-old with huge potential. Could be someone, I don't expect her to come close to winning it at all, but someone who could easily provide a few upsets on route to, say, round 4 or something like that.
Some predictions through gritted teeth there, Dan, I think. And it's only fair that I do the same to Drew as well before we go. So on the women's side, Drew, who's jumping out to you? Or who would you at a push have to suggest?
I love the Kostyuk shout. 70-1 right now is wild. She absolutely has the top end potential to go far in this tournament, and it's been sort of the name of the game to find the next up and comer as far as price shopping goes, and in the women's side in the futures. So that's a great one. The seeding is a little tricky here. It looks like Ash Barty 1 seed, Simona Halep 2 seed. I don't mind taking on either of those 2 seeds in the quarter, to be honest. The price on Halep I think is a little aggressive. I wouldn't put her at 12-1. I'd have her closer to 20-1. Serena Williams similarly at 12-1. I have her closer to 25 right now. Her form of late has really not been impressive on the numbers side of things, and her kind of mental edge, the general legend intimidation, the legend status, the legend factor that Dan mentioned earlier about Federer doesn't really have the same cachet today as it did a couple of years ago. So Serena at 12-1, I think, is a bad price. And yeah, I mean, Sabalenka at 10-1 is fair, but Dan is exactly right that if she gets the right draw and wins a couple early matches, that's going to get short real quick. And you can play that game and, watch that price come in. Because she's stepped her level of quality of play up enough that the likelihood that she has a shocking early round upset here, I think, is low. She's going to get a reasonably favorable draw. Her current ranking is 7, or her seed is 7 seed, so she'll be one of the 2 best players in one of the quarters. And if she gets in the same quarter as Simona Halep, for instance, or Ash Barty, or even Kenin, I think Sabalenka should be probably even odds to come out of that quarter. So 10-1 for her right now is a fair look. And of what I've seen social media wise, Vika Azarenka looks like she's in the best shape of her life. She's at 18-1. She'll be another very popular. That number will come in also a lot if she does well early, because she's such a fan favorite. People have been waiting so long for this comeback and like to see her win a slam again. So that's another one at 18-1 that I don't think that has potential to really come in pretty aggressively. Similarly, Bianca Andreescu, 17-1 is a fan. She has a lot of market support if she looks good. So the 3 prices that I think could be the most quickly impacted in terms of coming in are Sabalenka, Andreescu, and Azarenka. And then we haven't even mentioned the market favorite, Naomi Osaka, on this entire podcast. And honestly, I never really know until you see her play at the level that is the best in the world but once you see it, So I almost want to say this entire conversation could be for naught if she shows up and she's and she's firing missiles and completely unflappable in the high leverage moments of a match again. Then I'll bet it's hers to lose, and it's a very real possibility that she could be at that level of play. She's at 7-1 right now. The fact that 7-1 even is your top price is crazy. And yeah, if you're seeing it, and if she looks if she looks kind of nuclear hot like she has in a handful of slams that we've seen her win, then set 7-1 is going to evaporate.
Well, I think that is just about all the time that we've got for today, and not long until the action gets underway, of course. And obviously, I just want to say a massive thanks to Dan and Drew for coming on the show, and a big thank you to everyone for tuning in as well. Remember to head over to pinnacle.com to take advantage of our low margins and high limits across all tennis markets. And as always, please gamble